Black Tower Radio. I'm your host, Nathan Ford. Jake Fox is here. We're in BC Studios, broadcasting on WNRT. Go to worldnewsradio.today. Worldnewsradio.today. We're broadcasting 1040 AM and 92.1 FM. WYSL, Rochester, Buffalo. And, yeah, we got dumped on. I got my shoveling on. It's nice. It's good exercise shoveling, Jack. And it's good for the soul. It centers you. And you have to do it. You have to do it. Your wife says that's your job. That's what you do. Your girlfriend says that to you. Your respective other. They make that very apparent that is your job to do. And you have to get up very, very early. You got to work at 7. You got to get up at 4 now. It changes the game up a little bit. It makes you a little more angry. But then you're revived and you feel good when you're at work because of all the extracurricular, work that, you've been doing some aerobic workout. And I don't know really why I'm talking about this because we have a lot of work to do. I think about these sort of things and the aerobic workout that just life is. It's a stress reliever is what I'm saying. Work is good for the soul. Paul Craig Roberts may agree with me. Paul Craig Roberts is our guest on the Black Tower Radio. We've had him on a few times now. We love talking to him. And he was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Economic Policy, Associate Editor of the Wall Street Journal, columnist for Business Week, Scripps, Howard News Service, Creators Syndicate. His new book, How America Was Lost. I'd like to know that, actually. Maybe we can talk about that. What went wrong? But you can pick it up in print by Clarity Press, ebook format at Amazon.com. Go to paulcraigroberts.org. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Pleased to be with you.
I want to begin our conversation with this story of the new chief of the U.S. Broadcasting Board of Governors. Now, yes, it is on the surface kind of a silly story, but I think we can begin our conversation here with this Andrew Lack character, who has declared that the Russian news service RT, which broadcasts in multiple languages, to be a terrorist organization equivalent to Boko Haram in the Islamic State. And yeah, I think it's the propaganda machine of Washington. I want to begin our conversation. Let's have this dialogue unfold with Paul Craig Roberts, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Well, sure, of course.
So what do you think about all this? Washington's propaganda machine that continues.
Well, clearly, Andrew Lack doesn't have any respect for the American people. To equate a mild-mannered news service with the Islamic State and Boko Haram, that's so silly. I mean, why wasn't he laughed out of office? He was just appointed, actually. So clearly they've appointed a maniac to this job. The United States, I think, in Washington, let me put this differently, not the United States, Washington, I think it's disturbed because RT reports the news objectively, actually says what's happening, and this then contradicts the propaganda line that comes out of Washington and that all other news agencies follow. Now, it could be that Andrew Lack was just trying to send a message to RT that get closer to our position or we'll run you out of the country, we'll close you down. I suspect that the absurd statement he made was meant to intimidate and make RT feel like it has to pull in its horns and not tell so much truth and start giving more attention to supporting Washington's line. So I suspect that's what it's really about. I mean, it's hard to imagine anybody being stupid enough to think that RT has anything whatsoever in common with Boko Haram or the Islamic State. So I just say it's a message sent in a very crude way, and we'll just have to hope that RT doesn't pull in its horns and become more like the useless American TV media in order to be permitted to keep operating in the United States.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking to Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Economic Policy and Associate Editor of the Wall Street Journal. You're listening to Black Tower Radio with Dr. Paul Craig Roberts.
So, Dr. Roberts, what do you make of the situation brewing with Russia? It seems like the separatists and Kiev are trying to come to some sort of agreement here, while the language and the potential actions from Washington are ramping up. What exactly is going on here from your view?
Well, Kiev this was a coup organized by Washington. They worked at it for years, and they pulled it off in order to embarrass Russia, to distract Russia, and to use it to break off Russia's economic and political relationships with Europe. For example, that's the whole purpose of the sanctions. I don't think they do much harm to Russia, but by forcing Europeans into the sanction regime, it breaks up their relationships with Russia and thereby leaves them under Washington's thumb. Now, except for Crimea, which is the home of the Russian warm water naval base, which has been part of Russia for centuries, the other Russian-speaking areas in Ukraine, and basically Russian ethnic people, when they asked to rejoin the Russian state, the Russian government refused. And so the position of the Russian government is that those provinces, the so-called breakaway republics, should remain in Ukraine but have a good deal of autonomy so that they can't be persecuted or harmed in other ways. So Putin then has tried to resolve the conflict by saying, look, talk to the separatists and they'll stay in Ukraine, and you guys in Kiev just give them some autonomy. Well, the United States is not interested in resolving the conflict. It created the conflict in order to cause trouble for Russia, and therefore the United States has no interest whatsoever in resolving it, and will not. And, we even have Congress talking about arming the Ukrainians and training them and starting more of a war. Now, what the outcome depends on is Europe. The Europeans have finally gotten scared by the conflict that Washington is driving them into. They do not want a conflict with Russia. And so the Europeans are trying to stop the Americans, and the Chancellor of Germany and President of France have gone to Moscow to speak privately with Putin. Notice, no American president, no British president. And they're hoping to be able to come up with a solution that they can tell Washington is the solution that's going to be implemented. and not Washington's solution. Now, whether or not the Germans can actually assert foreign policy independence of Washington remains to be seen. Europe has not had an independent foreign policy since the end of World War II, because the Cold War and the defense of Europe was led by the United States, and if you're dependent on somebody else for your defense, then you have to follow their foreign policy line. So there are no European politicians alive who have ever experienced their country having an independent foreign policy. They don't even know what it means. So it looks like they're trying to assert their sovereignty, the Germans, the French, in order to put a halt to Washington's drive for war in Ukraine. And we'll just have to see if they're able to do that.
Sarkozy, the former French president, is publicly disagreeing with Washington's position on the Russian situation when it comes to Crimea. I mean, it's one thing to say it now, and it's another thing to say it after the election, but you are starting to see some, a real splinter between some European countries, namely Germany and France, and the United States position on the situation. I mean, do you think that'll hold up?
Well, that's what we were just talking about, and it remains to be seen whether the Europeans can get loose from American control of their foreign policy. They're trying to. Sarkozy, the previous president of France, said that France and Russia share a common European civilization. He said the Crimeans chose to go back to Russia, and we can't blame them for their choice. And Hollande, I think it was, maybe also Sarkozy, but I think Hollande said that France's interest with regard to Russia differed from Washington's interest. So whether these statements can be implemented in the sense of you see, Washington can't start a war over there if Europe doesn't go on with it. It has to have supply lines. It has to have ways of sending in armaments, and it needs cover. It needs European cover. I mean, this has to be some sort. We always have to have cover. A coalition of the willing or something, so that it's not just American unilateral aggression. So if the Europeans decide that this is too risky and too reckless, as the German foreign minister himself said the other day, he said the Washington policy is too risky, too reckless for Europe. And a number of the various so-called defense ministers of the European countries have said the same thing, that they do not want a war. So I think this is making it difficult for Washington. Now, whether the blackmail can be, from all the NSA spying, whether this can be pulled out, the bribes, threats, how Washington will respond, I don't know, but I do know that Washington is aware of the split because John Kerry denied that there is a split. So why would you deny that there's a split if there wasn't? So we just have to see. We don't know. I don't know whether Europeans will just simply abandon the American determination of their foreign policy in order to protect their own interest, or whether they will continue to sacrifice their own interests in order to serve Washington. We just have to see.
We recently, a couple weeks ago, we had a RT host, Daniel Estulin, on the show, and he said, well, and I know this is a fact, that Russia is buying tons of gold, the most gold in the world, every single month, and the sanctions against Russia are putting them in a position where, you know, that they're forced to do this, and he calls this economic checkmate. What do you think he means by that?
Well, I'm not sure what he means. The Chinese are actually buying the most gold. They have far more money than anybody else, us included. I think what the Russians are doing, unless Putin has been very patient with Europe. He keeps waiting on them to realize their own interests and serve their own interests. You know, he keeps telling them, "We're here for you." But I think his main response to the sanctions is to turn his back on Europe, to develop the economic and strategic relationship with China, with India, with the other BRICS countries, to cease using the dollar as a payment mechanism, to cease using the SWIFT transaction mechanism for clearing international payments, to cease using American credit card companies to build their own internet type systems so they're free from Google and the rest, and simply to make the country self-sustaining, to leave all this globalism BS, you know. Globalism is something we use to entrap people and put them under our thumb. And I think that the Russian government realizes that the effort to integrate with the West was a strategic error because it gave Washington a financial hegemony over them, because all the payment systems and all the settlement systems are American-based. So now if this Ukrainian mess breaks Europe off from America, then Putin will work to incorporate Europe into the Russian trade zones that he's developing with Belarus, with China, with the former Soviet republics in Central Asia, you know, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. And Europe may find this very attractive. He's actually made this offer to Europe. And he's also offered Greece financial support. So this lets the Greeks stand up to the EU and their private German and Dutch bank creditors and force a better resolution of their debt situation, or simply walk away from the West and rely on the Russians for financing. So what we are witnessing is a potential breakup of NATO because of the potential breakup of the EU. If Greece leaves the EU and achieves financing from Russia or China, this is going to pull Italy out too, and Spain and Portugal, because they don't want to go through the extreme austerity that has devastated the Greek population. And they don't need to. If there's Russia and China saying, "What are you fooling with those idiots for? We'll finance you without doing these things to you." So the way the people in Washington have played the Ukrainian thing could end up blowing up in their face if the result of it is to dissolve the EU and NATO. And I'll say one more thing here, because in my opinion, the Russians hold all the cards, not the fool in the White House. He has no cards. The Russians could do two things that would just completely devastate. They could tell the Europeans that since you're participating in the American economic attack on our country, trying to harm us, we default on the debt. So now you got a second debt problem. On top of the sovereign debt problem in Europe, you now have our sovereign debt. We're not going to pay you. Go to hell. Well, that would, of course, bring down a large number of the European banks they're very thinly capitalized. Or the Russian government could say, look, here is NATO causing us all this trouble, sanctions, killing Russians in Ukraine, overthrowing a democratic elected government in Ukraine, imposing American vassal state. We've come to the conclusion that we don't sell energy to NATO members. NATO would collapse instantly because almost the entirety of Eastern and Western Europe are dependent on Russian natural gas, especially if they were to announce that in the middle of the winter. The industry of every country would have to close down just in order to keep the people from freezing to death. The economies would collapse. The sovereign debt burdens would be worse. So there are all kinds of things that Russia can do that we can't do.
We're talking to Dr. Paul Craig Roberts.
Break the American empire into tiny pieces. They can do it whenever they want. So why haven't they done it? Well, I think they're following a non-provocative response. They're relying on Europe to cease being American puppets and to represent themselves. And if not, they're just going to integrate with the East. That's where the people are. That's where the rising economies are. So, but if things get too bothersome for the Russians, they can simply tell the Europeans that we don't sell energy to our enemies. And no member of NATO has any access whatsoever to Russian energy.
Well, you have the upper hand. You know, there's nothing quite like staying warm. You know, that is something that, that's the number one thing, Jack, just staying warm. If you have that string, then that's it, right? I mean...
Staying warm is very important. Yes.
Food, yeah, that's a big one. If they got that one. Any kind of alliance, you know, it's like you'd give up your, okay, you're not my friend anymore. I just want to stay warm, you know. But, yeah, they're taking, like you said, non-provocative approach. But before we run out of time with Paul Craig Roberts, I do want to get your take on the mounting violence and ISIS, the terrorist organization that's gaining steam now. And I just want to know, we've had guests on the show talking about connections with ISIS and the CIA, as ISIS being a mechanism that is being used and handled by the U.S. What do you see as how America should handle it, or are they handling it in some kind of way that maybe perhaps the average citizen wouldn't know about?
Well, look, this is another thing that's blown up in Washington. ISIS was a creation of the CIA used to overthrow Gaddafi in Libya. And then they sent those guys to Syria to overthrow Assad. But somewhere along the way, these people realized they were an independent power, that they had military prowess. They are jihadists. That is, they are Islamists. They're not secular. And they said that we're tired of the West. We're tired of Washington, the French, the British determining everything that happens in the Middle East. We're tired of the artificial borders that the French and British drew up. And look, we've got all this power. We're just now an independent state. And they are creating new country, partly out of Syria, partly out of Iraq. And because they are now standing up against the West in such a fierce way, they're attracting huge numbers of people, of fighters, and they seem to be very effective. So it's something Washington did not expect. Yes, Washington was behind the beginning of it, but it grew beyond Washington's control. And what they're actually saying is, look, Muslims that support the West are traitors. We can't have them in our midst anymore because they sell us out and they make us slaves of the West. We've been slaves of the West since the end of World War I. We're tired of it. We're not going to be the West slaves anymore. And so we are ruthless. And you better join us, because if you don't, we're going to kill you. And they keep killing any Westerners they can get their hands on, just to show their total contempt and of the West. They despise the Western people and will not in any way serve their interests. So this puts all of the American puppet states, all the remaining puppet states in the Middle East, in great danger. Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, because these are governments that do not represent their own people, but who represent Washington's interests, Western interests. So it's a huge change, and I don't really know what Washington will be able to do about it. If after 13 years of fighting the Taliban they couldn't prevail, they're not going to prevail against ISIS.
It's a very bitter pill for people to swallow, the idea that ISIS was created by the CIA, and now you see these horrible, violent atrocities happening.
Well, wait just a minute. Whatever atrocities they're doing, they're nothing whatsoever compared to the ones the United States has committed.
I guess, yeah, let me rephrase that, because it's not, yes, I agree. And I think what's happening is that it's in our living rooms. I think it's for the first time you see a man in a cage being burnt alive on TV. And it's there, and it's apparent. So maybe not. It's obviously not the worst atrocities.
Well,
but it's more apparent.
We drop cluster bombs on children, on schools, on hospitals. The United States in the 21st century is responsible for the death, mutilation, dispossession, dislocation of millions of Muslims who never raised a hand against the United States. Funerals, weddings, children's soccer games, farmers in the field, slaughtered day after day for 14 years. Entire countries in total ruin. There's never been an atrocity like this. Whatever ISIS does, it's like a molehill compared to a mountain, compared to what the United States has been doing. And the American people have supported it. They're not outraged by it. They've got no right whatsoever to be outraged by the Islamic State.
Yeah. No, I mean, is it that the population simply don't know about what's happening, that they haven't been told what was going on?
No, they do. How can you not know? How can you not know? You know, every day during the Afghan war, and there'd be an announcement from the Afghan, okay, today they killed 7 more kids. And the military forces will say, well, we'll have to investigate this. And then the next day it would be, oh, it was a kid's soccer game got hit. And they'll say, oh, we'll investigate this. And then, oh, it's the little girl who got brutally raped, and then they killed her and all of her family, so there would be nobody to report it. Oh, we'll have to investigate this. I mean, how can they not know?
That indifference to evil.
That's what it is.
You know, and
the American people have been indifferent to the evil that their own government has inflicted on millions of people for 14 years.
You know, it's one side note is a cultural thing, are these video games, and it was fascinating. I have to bring it up because it does tie in. I saw a video game commercial where there's 2 young kids and they're in battle, and the way that they film it, it's so real, the battle, right? And they're shooting, and then at the end of it, they're high-fiving each other at the end of this thing. You know, at the end of being in an actual real battle, they're high-fiving now. And it got me thinking about just exactly what we were saying about the indifference to evil. We're being taught, to some degree, to not stand up to violence on a daily basis.
When you talk about these things to the average American people, you're like, listen, you know, we're drone bombing weddings and funerals and killing children. I mean, just the other day, we drone bombed a 13-year-old boy who a 13-year-old Yemeni boy who was burned to death after being shot by a U.S. drone, whose father and brother were killed by a U.S. drone. And his worst fear was dying from being shot by a drone. I mean, he talked about it all the time. There's a YouTube video with him talking about it, how he fears drones so much. This gets no coverage from the U.S. media. I mean, if you dig, you can find it. But people are kept from this. So, I mean, when you talk to the average American about things like this, their eyes glaze over, and they just don't care. And they think about, you know, there's no excuse for that. I mean, but they think just another dead terrorist, and you know that's disgusting. But if the nightly news doesn't tell this kind of a story, I mean, they're just not. They're
not allowed to, Jake. They'd all be fired. They're not allowed to tell this on the news, but it's still available. And, I mean, the notion of a 13-year-old boy being a terrorist is far-fetched to begin with.
Yeah.
But, you know, there's a difference now between how our atrocities in the Middle East are covered and how they were covered in Vietnam, because we did get the TV coverage of the little girl running naked from the napalm.
Yeah.
And that's stuck in the minds of people who were here then for a long time.
Yeah.
But you see, under Clinton, the media were concentrated in a few hands. So the independence, the independent ownership, the dispersed media no longer exists. There are 5 mega corporations. They control the media. We've talked about this before. The value of these big media companies is the federal broadcast licenses. If you go against the government, your license doesn't get renewed, and your multi-billion-dollar company falls to zero. Journalists don't run the news companies. They're run by former government officials and corporate advertising executives. And the journalists and reporters know if they say anything, it's the end of their career. Look, who was the distinguished woman who resigned just recently from one of the main media television companies? You know, she'd been there 21 years, and she finally said, look, they will not let me report. I can't say anything that's true. Who was that woman? You know, it just happened. It was a it was in the news for a few minutes.
Oh, the name escapes me as well. I forgot her name.
She was a well-known, long-time career. And she just finally said, this is it. There's no, it's fake. I'm not going to be part of it. Well, so there isn't the media. But people have to know that. And if you talk to them, they don't trust the media. They don't trust the government. And yet, the next lie the government comes out with, they believe it. There's Russian tanks in Ukraine.
No.
I mean, so...
Well, try saying anything about Israel at all, anything disparaging about Israel's foreign policy, and see what happens to your career. I mean, that's
you're
over.
in the news business, yeah.
Sure.
Oh, you get fired. Or even in the universities. In universities. You know, we see the Israel lobby can reach in and block tenure appointments. They even could reach in to a Catholic university and block the tenure appointment of a Jew who had criticized Israel. And the recent case, we know the tenured professor at Virginia Tech who was offered a tenured position at the University of Illinois, and so he accepted it. He resigned his position at Virginia Tech, sold his house, moved his family to Illinois, and 2 weeks before his courses were to begin, the chancellor of the University of Illinois withdrew the appointment because the Israel lobby had complained. He had tweeted something about Israeli misbehavior against the Palestinians. Yeah, this is an amazing control over free speech, free thought, academic freedom.
Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, our conversation with Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, always enlightening. And yes, it can be discouraging understanding the enemy. Of course, you know, we can always raise our voice, and we can do our part on this radio show and continue to have you back on and have these conversations. That's the part that we're going to do, and we want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Well, it's always a relief to talk to people who have some courage.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So anytime you want me back, just let me know. All the best to both of you.
All right, great. Thank you very much. Take care now. Right, ladies and gentlemen, we just talked to Paul Craig Roberts, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Economic Policy under the Reagan administration, Associate Editor of the Wall Street Journal. So Paul Craig Roberts was there, and he knows, you know, if you're the editor of the Wall Street Journal, you understand the real pressure to report aligned news that's aligned with the interests of your government. He knows that pressure. He was in the White House. Dr. Paul Craig Roberts was in the White House.
He was in Reagan's cabinet.
He was in Reagan's cabinet, you know, and so he understands more than the average person about the real pressure and the real... And then, but for him to have such scathing remarks to say.
He knows how government works. He's been on the inside. And his scathing remarks, I mean, and it's not like he didn't have, like he didn't leave Reagan's cabinet and, I don't know, take some consulting job somewhere. He left Reagan's cabinet and became the senior editor of the Wall Street Journal. He was the senior editor of Business Week. He was the editor for Scripps Howard News Service. He was a professor of economics at Georgetown University. I mean, this man is a highly distinguished man who knows how power works, and his analysis of what's happening is incredibly scary.
Yeah, how many people do we talk to that, you know, have, like you said, his resume, who are just openly questioning 9/11, openly saying that this government, the government that I worked for in Reagan's cabinet, in all honesty, uses false flag attacks to gain ground, to push agenda, to move this thing forward. But to hear from a guy with his resume and being where he came from, it just seems to like discourage me even more. But I don't want to be more discouraged, Jake. We have to keep this conversation and this dialogue going. Let me tell you about our next guest here. Our guest coming up here, defense analyst, retired colonel of the Pakistan Army, Colonel Abdul Naeem, we're going to be talking to. And we're going to be talking about Pakistan-India relations.
ISIS.
We're going to be talking about ISIS.
And China's influence in Afghanistan will be an interesting question to ask you.
Well, that's a real thing. And, since we have exited Afghanistan, China's now going into Afghanistan. And there's a real power struggle going on there. China does believe that they can do it better. And so what hand is the U.S. holding here in regards to Afghanistan? Letting China in? Maybe we want them to. So what is the conflict there? And perhaps Colonel Abdul Naeem can suss some of those things out.
Everyone wants that lithium and gas lines that are going on there. So
the lithium and the gas. That's what it comes down to. The good stuff,
All of the electronics require those rare earth metals. We need them for our smartphones. And lithium is one of the things that makes it go. So
there's a lot of lithium in Afghanistan. They're going in there and getting it. Isn't that funny? A lot of this comes down to this strange element in the ground. Getting that out of there for the battery. And then technology advances. At some point, you don't need the lithium anymore. Then it's something else. And then we're in another area.
Sure.
We're over here now.
All of a sudden, Chad is really important.
Right, you hear about Chad.
We're worried about Chad's, their election process there. Oh, they have a tyrant that is manipulating the elections. The Chadians aren't, they're not feeling the democratic process in Chad, and we need to go in there and have a regime change and take all of their whatever the heck Chad has.
Yeah, just some name of some element in the ground. We're going to Chad. We're painting a bad picture of Chad now. That's what we do. Destabilize. How good are we at destabilizing stuff? Boy, if you want things to churn into riots, you can call the CIA. Like if you want a party to just dissolve into mayhem, they know right what to do. They only need to send one guy maybe.
Well, they in Afghanistan they only sent a few thousand soldiers because the natives, the people of Afghanistan were cooperative. And it was very easy to drive them out. But, and then it turned into a massive quagmire due to unfulfilled promises and, how we deal with nations psychopathically, basically.
Yeah. It's very interesting for me because America has been accused of being the masters of war, and really working both sides. The India-Pakistan seems to me to be that kind of example. I mean, what is really going on here?
Yeah.
I mean, we're sending a whole bunch of money to Pakistan. They're buying this submarine, by the way. This submarine is insane. I have it here somewhere, but it's this nuclear submarine. They have a submarine, right? Then at the same time, of course, we know about Obama aligning himself with India and throwing support behind India. I mean, what is going on here? And then the wars since 1947, 3 major wars between India and Pakistan, hundreds of thousands of lives lost. The Kashmir battle continues on, and here is America working both sides of this. thing? Why? What is the interest there? What are you trying to do? Are you trying to create some kind of peace? But it was never about creating peace anywhere in the world. It's never about that at all.
From what I understand of the Pakistan situation, Pakistan, from what I understand, is like China's Israel. That's their, their bedrock, their special relationship with another nation, and they're not going to let that situation deteriorate. So what we'll do is play, Pakistan off of India, and India and China are, they're forging economic relationships and they're getting closer, but they also have a real rivalry going on there. China and India do. I mean, not only economically and militarily now, because India is a rising military and economic power, but they have, from what I understand, they have border disputes. So I know on a Chinese passport that they've released, they released the ancient map of China, or the map of China that obviously that the powers that be in the Communist Party want to extend the maps to the old ancient Chinese empires that they have, and some of it took over land, a bit of land from India. And India was, they released a statement on it saying, this is absurd and all that. But yeah, they have real problems between each other. And we use Pakistan as a wedge between them. So it's a perfect little game that we're playing there as well.
That's very, very interesting. Yeah, very, very interesting. And then in the background, you have ISIS going on. You have Kerry going to Pakistan. Kerry recently went to Pakistan, said, we're going to send some aid for you to fight ISIS on your borders and these sort of things. I just wonder sometimes about the money that's going to Pakistan, how it's being used, and how it's being sold to the American people. There's many different levels here. First off, I have Paul Craig Roberts telling me that ISIS started in the CIA as a mechanism of the U.S. I also have Kerry, a story coming out where Kerry is going to Pakistan, offering money to Pakistan to fight ISIS there. So what I'm hearing in my mind sometimes is a psychotic, neurotic feed of fuzz and horrible behavior, because I see the masters of war at work here. Selling nuclear submarines.
Like a purposeful feedback loop.
Sure, a purposeful feedback loop of weapons and death, essentially. Send weapons to a country, right? Sell weapons to any number of countries that want to be armed because there's a threat from you. But it's not you. It's an entity that you created. It's actually, if you're insane, a psychotic, insane, sadist, horrible person, it's actually a great idea, as a sort of business model here. Create the need. But this submarine, and also India is also buying tons of weapons too, and India has the ability to hit many places in Europe. They were saying it's going pretty. They can really do some damage.
They have some ICBMs.
Right. Yeah. So that can be pretty dangerous there. So yeah, but we're going to talk to Colonel Abdul Naim about the conflict. Yeah, like we said, China and Afghanistan. We're going to take a little quick break here. We're going to get him on the line, and we'll be right back. You're listening to Black Tower Radio. We're broadcasting WNRT. Go to worldnewsradio.today, and we're broadcasting 1040 AM and 92.1 FM WYSL Rochester, Buffalo. We'll be right back in a few minutes with Colonel Abdul Naim.